everyone. Welcome back to Manufacturing Hub. If you guys are watching live, it's Wednesday afternoon. If you're not watching live, it's probably not Wednesday afternoon. If you guys are new here, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. Vlad and I, super excited last week to have Travis and Kevin from Inductive on going and talking about their Prove It session and doing a deep dive on the application. As I think we said live, that's one of these sessions that we probably could have spent 4 hours doing, and yet an hour and a half later, we still have a bunch of questions. Although I feel very enthused after seeing that session as to what is possible. On the manufacturing hub side, I think we've still got a couple more of those coming at you, and excited to do a couple more deep dives on some of these applications. Having said that, this week we're talking all about an AI survival guide, and that's ahead of our next theme that's coming up starting, I believe, next week, in which we're doing industrial AI applications. And so it's our hope with that to go talk to at least 4 different groups, go do a deep dive on the particular and specific applications. And from that point, go ahead and help everyone understand in some very specific and linear verticals what is a little bit more possible. So today, Vlad and I are going to go in. We're going to talk about some AI. We're going to talk about what we're doing, what we're seeing, what we think that the market looks like. And if you guys have questions or thoughts or comments, please go ahead and let us know. Beyond that, if you have specific applications or groups that you think are doing something really cool that we should go see and highlight in the coming weeks, 100%, please let us know what that looks like. I feel like Vlad, and you feel free to chime in, but I'm like, oh, that's really cool. And then I find 10 more other really cool, interesting applications that are possible. Do you also continue to see more and more different, interesting industrial AI style applications?
I think there's no shortage of companies in this space. I think for me at least, it is very important to try and understand where exactly they fit and what
Mhm.
type of a solution they provide. I think, and we'll get into this in a little bit more detail, there's a lot of different areas that are impacted by AI. But for me specifically, I'm very hands-on. I'm trying to understand what the opportunity is, what kind of business problem they actually solve. I think there's a lot of companies, at least in my conversations, that have fallen in the trap of building sort of like everything that is leveraged on top of AI for a multitude of different solutions. So that's why I'm open to having conversations. I'm open to looking at certain websites of companies, but again, I'm trying to understand where the business value lies. To get us maybe started with a more general conversation, right? Before we move into industrial AI, so to speak, I think it's important to understand where the general landscape is. And some of these points are going to be, I would say, obvious depending on where you have experimented with and what kind of solutions you have worked with. But I did want to give a landscape of what has happened over a couple of years. Again, I don't want to make the assumption that everyone is familiar with all of this, but basically around 2 years ago, we started to see a LLM, so to speak, revolution. And one of the first titles, I would say about a year and a half to 2 years ago, that we have seen emerge is prompt engineering, right? And this was a very
Mhm.
popular, I would say, job posting for many different companies. And the intent was to create prompts that are better than the general public, right? So I would assume, again, all of us at this point have been at least experimenting with ChatGPT, with Claude Code, with Gemini, right? So different flavors of LLMs, but we all should understand by now that the structure of the prompt is going to be very important. About a year or so ago, and again, these timelines are loose because a lot of this moves at a fairly fast pace. We have started to, I would say, manage AI more so than just prompt for a final solution. So, about a year to a year and a half ago, we started being project managers using AI to build a variety of applications. And of course, as we progress through these steps that I'm explaining, we have also realized how to reduce what's called AI slop, right? So, this was a very popular term and still remains in certain circles. But essentially, what we've learned is that by reprompting AI and giving it more and more context, we can reduce, again, these anomalies or these just very generic type of outputs that AI would create otherwise. So instead of just being given a single prompt and then creating the final product, we have understood that the proper approach is to start creating design sprints, explaining it in detail, going in a back and forward manner, and basically building out a structure to the project before implementation. About a year or so ago, we started to use AI agents, right? And so, for those of you who are not familiar with AI agents, all it really is a structured way to break down tasks and allowing AI to an extent to run with it, right? So instead of going back and forth on a single prompt like you would in the commercial style of ChatGPT, what you can have an agent do is perform tasks based on a list of things that either it broke down the main problem into or you as the engineer have given it to. And of course, that opened up a lot of different opportunities. If you have been on Cloud Code, I want to say last fall, the workflow has changed quite significantly. So instead of going back and forth, like I said, and reprompting the AI agent, you would give it a list of tasks that it can start working on. And a lot of times, including myself, you would open a second window and then you're running a parallel workflow. You would open a third window. And again, we can get into a lot of the definitions, but basically we saw where the limits were in terms of a couple of different things. So number one, of course, is the tokens. So if you start paying for the models instead of using, again, the commercial or even the free versions, you will run into the issue of paying for LLMs. And with Claude, you have different tiers of applications. You can start off with $20 a month, at which point, usually, I exhaust that in a few hours of runtime. You can then upgrade that to $200 a month, in which case you can exhaust that in 6 to 8 hours, depending on how many parallel workflows you have. But ultimately, you have a limited amount of tokens. The second problem that started happening is the context window. And of course, the newer models have increased the size of context. But to define that a little bit better, the more time you spend with AI, the more tools you give it, the more information you present to it, the generally better decision it can make, or the generally better the output can be. And again, I say that generally because we will discuss as to why it also fails, but you run out of the context window. So it is not possible to simply give it all of the, for example, PDFs in the world and then allow it to parse that information, simply because of the memory and the context window that is associated with it. And of course, like I mentioned, more does not necessarily equal better. So there have been different benchmarks. Again, I would say a lot more on the software development side and IT side than manufacturing, where it was demonstrated that giving AI more information basically dilutes the prompt, right? And what that means in simple terms, if I ask it to paint, let's say, a yellow circle, that is a fairly specific task. But if I give it 2,000 lines of code that describe the circle and give it other information, it's going to be fairly confused on what the actual task or request is. So there's been benchmarks where individuals have shown that giving it a large prompt with specific set points makes it very difficult for AI to recover those set points were prompted for them from the longer text. And hopefully it makes sense. Again, I'm happy to point to the resources. About 6 months to, I would say, a year now ago, we developed or have gotten access to MCP tools. And of course, this became very foundational in most AI workflows, whether that's just general prompting or agent based development. And so MCPs are basically connectors to applications that augment what AI is capable of. So to give you a very specific example. So if you want to develop a landing page, right? So you're building a simple HTML and CSS based website, you could have written the code using Claude Code, over a year ago, and generally it is pretty good. But AI does not have access to see the web page without an MCP. And so, one example of that would be Playwright. So, you can install Playwright as part of Claude Code, and then it can actually see and basically parse the image from the website to make adjustments. So, it becomes a lot more capable with the different MCPs. And of course, I'm oversimplifying this, right? But there's MCPs available for all sorts of different applications, including for the industrial space. And that's the demo that Dave was referring to a little bit earlier that we had with Inductive. They're releasing their own MCP to expose data not only for what's stored in the database in the historian, but also the capabilities to develop within an inductive automation or ignition application. So once again, capability does not necessarily equal performance. And so this is where a lot of the challenges still reside with the current versions of AI, meaning that if you simply add everything or all sorts of MCPs, all sorts of context, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a better result based at least on my personal experimentations. I'm curious to hear what people in the chat are going to say. But generally speaking, you want to be very cautious what you give access to your AI to, and also what kind of context you provide it with. And so this is where, again, the more recent advancements have been skills, at least on the Claude Code side, where you can very specifically align how certain workflows need to be executed, which MCPs are part of this specific execution. And so the intent overall is to make sure that you get a much better result when prompting the LLMs by specifying critical connections to different systems at that given time. So again, my general overview right now is I think there's a ton of opportunities. Obviously, for the conversation that we're going to have, we're going to focus more on the industrial side. I think there's a ton to be experimented on. I'm still spending a ton of time trying to understand what the best approach is. I think everyone now has a certain workflows. I know that there's some tutorials and some individuals sharing what they're doing. I think that the best is yet to come, but we will see and keep a close out. There's a few other features that have also been released, but ultimately, it's going to be interesting to see where the AI front goes in the next months and or years. Dave, any thoughts, questions, ideas?
Yeah, no, I think it's very interesting. So you and I, Vlad, have had many, many hours of conversation when it comes to these tools, Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini or again, kind of any of the major players in the North American market. I think it's really interesting. I think you brought up a couple of good points on the token side and on the context window side. And I think on the token side, so tokens are not really anything new when it comes to is not really anything new when it comes to software, especially SaaS software or cloud software. I think we are just seeing people and groups running into these limits for the first time. And as you were kind of describing that in the context window, it made me think of kind of applications, right? So it's like any of the computer applications 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, right back when the entire computer was running on a gig or less of RAM. And the more plugins and other things you put on to your Word or your Excel or any of your video editing softwares, the slower everything ran because it had to go and work through it. So, and while this is certainly not a debate as to who uses or who doesn't use their tools, the better. It has been particularly interesting to see how some people continue to run up against these limits within any of your kind of base tier or base paid for tier or even most maxed out plan. And then we're also buying additional tokens in order to continue to go and continue to run. I would say it's particularly interesting when we talk about specific models as to which model is good for what thing. I would say, especially on the Claude side, I've been impressed with all of the models that I have and have used. Now, have I gotten wild hallucinations? Absolutely. Do I ask it to go, please give me links to every specific thing that it quantifies so that I can go do some additional research? Absolutely, 100% yes as well. So
Hmm.
this certainly seems like we are getting into the baseline of people are learning, and we are expanding at absolutely insane rates. We talked about it, what, 2 or 3 weeks ago or a month ago, Vlad, as to all of the data centers that are going up. And we will pause and not bring judgment on the data centers of this show.
Hmm.
People are putting up data centers, and RAM and hard drive space, or RAM and hard drives, continue to get exponentially more expensive for those of us who hoard our own data at home. And so it will be interesting, the direction that we go.
Yeah, and look, we're gonna bring up an interesting question,
Mhm.
right? And to your comments, Dave, I'm a little bit frustrated on the RAM and just general storage side, because I'm a, how would I best put it, like a home lab enthusiast. So I enjoy building server
You're
hardware.
like 6 or 7 levels above enthusiast. Home lab
Well,
professional. Is
but
that is that something we can tag you with, Vlad?
sure, but it is a bit of a struggle, I would say, right now to justify some of the acquisitions. And I think, again, the comment that I would make before I answer this question is, I think that there's a lot of capital going into AI. I am curious to see, and obviously I have my own maybe opinion or hypothesis where it's going to go, but what the general cost to the public is going to be when all of this is said and done, right? In 3 to 5 years, let's call it. I think it's going to be nowhere nearly as inexpensive as it is today. But the question is from Lana Lebdeva. Vladimir, I'm curious, how do you usually navigate all the information out there right now? Do you research things yourself, and do you go from site to site, or do you follow certain blogs, communities, YouTube channels, etc.? So this is, again, I would say, and the general sentiment is, I think there's a very big division between the experts, at least that I have talked to and that I follow. I would say that on one side, there's a complete disbelief in AI, right? And just the general sentiment that it's not going to go anywhere. In a couple of years, we're going to basically dismantle all of these data centers, and there's no real value because of reasons we'll get into in just a moment in the meat of the conversation. And then on the flip side, there's people who are completely bought in, are basically claiming that they can do absolutely everything. They can replace entire teams when it comes to sales, outreach, engineering, so on and so forth. And the only thing that cannot be replaced, is basically hands-on labor. So, to answer your question, I do a lot of research on my own. I think that there's only a handful of individuals that share the information right now. And again, it could be made the argument that maybe they're too busy building actual solutions to share their workflows. It could also be that a lot of the people are only sharing because they're trying to sell you either their course or their membership platform. But to be honest with you, there is information, but not nearly as much as I would like myself. So I start with YouTube. I follow a couple of people on Twitter. The IT and software communities are a lot more active, for whatever reason, on Twitter. So there's going to be reputable guys that will share workflows. They will explain what they're doing. They will explain some of the features, at least in my opinion, better than what you will find on LinkedIn. So yes, I guess hopefully that answers the question. I have not found any specific books per se, but a lot of it comes from watching a video, then experimenting on my own, running into issues, right? So the other day I was trying to figure out an MCP connection to Webflow, which is a website builder for a small business. And so I ran out of tokens within, I believe, like 45 minutes because of how it was utilizing the MCP, right? And so it's just experimentation, and then it's figuring out what works better, what works worse, from my standpoint. And of course, again, talking to peers, I think in the industrial space, companies are still willing to discuss what they have built and willing to show what they have built. I've not seen that many people share the actual workflows, but you can oftentimes ask them that question and understand what they're using, what has or hasn't worked. Dave, any thoughts on your side on that front?
Um, lots of thoughts. I think it's a fantastic question. I think Vlad, to your point, with where we are, there's still a lot of unknowns, and I think a lot of it is enthusiasts going and working through the problems to see what makes sense. Now, I will say to those points, going and asking Claude or going and asking any or one of these services as to what's the best way to go about doing something makes a lot of sense, right? Like I have found that going and asking these tools, what's the best way to go about doing this particular thing, is extremely helpful and is extremely valuable. Having said that, on the skills side, especially going and building a skill or with Claude or one of these other services, having access to any of the normal range of skills saves a lot of space when it comes to tokens. It saves a lot of cost when it comes to tokens. Saves a lot of cost when it comes to the context window. I will say, especially on your side, Vlad, one of the things that I've learned is like in my brain, I just want to dump everything in a single chat and just go chat back and forth and ask questions and kind of continue to move on. I have found if you leave all of those artifacts in the chat, it expands it significantly and makes it significantly more costly in
Mhm.
every sense of the term, in order to go ahead and use and utilize.
Yeah, and again, like I said, I think I resonate with that as well. I think there needs to be a lot of experimentation, and again, I think we're all learning to an extent in
Yeah.
parallel. Which, again, for better or worse, that's what I see happening. But I think there's no avoiding seeing it firsthand, right? So I can almost immediately speak to some individuals and ask them a couple of questions, and you can tell that they've not actually installed anything again besides the consumer versions of
Mhm.
ChatGPT and haven't really even created projects, giving it files, maybe manipulated images, manipulated code. And I think it's very important to do it on your own, not just have secondhand experience. There's a good question, I think, that we can transition into the main conversation from Constantine, right? And of course, it's more of a rhetorical question, I would say, more than anything else. But he's saying that would you say that we must ground AI applications in solving real problems for end users? We don't want to have a solution in search of a problem. We want a solution to a real problem. There is a lot of noise on YouTube right now, and I, trust me, I've been in these conversations, right? So at least for me, and I'll kick us
Mhm.
off, Dave, maybe on that front. The conversations with customers have always been in two very specific camps. Number one, they understand their process. They have generally mapped out the manufacturing lines or departments that they have, and they understand where the opportunities are for improvement. I would almost classify that as they understand automation, but they are uncertain if AI can aid in any way on that front. And then on the flip side, similar to what Konstantin is referring to, I have had potential customers reach out with the very broad request of we would like to understand how we can position ourselves better in this AI landscape,
Mhm.
make sure that we are competitive in 3 to 5 years. We have absolutely no idea as to where we would like to go, but we're trying to understand what AI can or is able to solve for us in a very broad sense, right?
Mhm.
So, obviously, having spent many years on the OT side, I can tell you almost immediately that if you don't provide at least with some certainty, right? And I say some because, of course, there's a lot of, I would say, like risk involved in how AI is going to actually play out, but with some certainty, a solution that is quantifiable in dollars. As to how much of a problem it's going to solve, it's going to be very difficult to obtain that funding, right? And what I mean by that is if you come in just in a broad sense, we would like to implement AI and we would like to allow us to use AI in a near or long-term future, it becomes very difficult for manufacturers or companies, I would say in general, to absorb all of that risk, at least in my experience. I think it's a lot more feasible when you come in and say, we have identified the opportunities. Here's what the workflow looks like. Here's where we believe AI can fit and solve some of these challenges. Here's the potential result of us solving them, and this is the dollar amount that it's going to cost, and obviously return to the business.
Yeah, I guess I think it's a really good question. In comment, Constantine, I think the best applications are applications that solve a real tangible problem. And so if you are a groups who is building AI applications for manufacturing industrial, go have a series of problems that you are going to solve absolutely 100%. Having said that, it certainly seems like lots of these groups are interested in moving towards this, right? Be it predetermined or otherwise, that they are interested in moving towards being able to go have and leverage AI solutions. I would say with that, especially as we saw at Prove It, Constantine, lots of groups have, their AI chatbots, right? And our AI chatbots valuable if they can answer real questions 100% for some particular applications. But if you get beyond any particular application, and you're looking to go deliver AI for an entire organization or AI for an entire enterprise, we run into a bunch of foundational issues, right? We run into a bunch of data collection. We run into a bunch of how do we go take this raw OT data, and if we build it into a UNS, or if we investigate and transpose it into contextualized data in another way, you absolutely have to go do that. There's an entire set of data governance that many groups like just don't even talk about. Like data governance is a thing in the IT world, right? Like if you go talk about data governance, and Vlad and I have had cybersecurity conversations when it came to data governance. I think maybe our first ICS cybersecurity theme, we had someone on talking about data governance. And man, if data governance doesn't seem more and more important every single one of these AI conversations I have. So those and probably 5 dozen other things I look at as foundational building blocks to move towards an AI solution. And is it possible? Like let's say that Vlad is like, hey, I have this AI solution that we're just going to network a bunch of PLCs together, and it's going to suck the raw data out, and it's going to go give you OEE, and I'll sell it to you for $10 per machine per month. If that worked, that would absolutely be fantastic. And solutions like that, in theory, could go allow you to skip a bunch of those other foundational steps or a bunch of those AI data governance, OT data governance style conversations for small, maybe even medium-sized groups and organizations. Once you get into an enterprise organization, you're going to have to go do these foundational steps. So that is, I suppose, a long way about coming to say, yes, I think the best AI industrial applications will solve real tangible problems. I think that almost every single end user I work with and have worked with and have had conversations with has major foundational steps that they have to go through before they can go talk about rolling out quote unquote AI applications to across the plant floor. I suppose having said that, I see we have like lots of conversations in which like ML style solutions, machine learning style solutions that are not AI are used and leveraged in various different industries in order to increase efficiency. And I suppose to be successful with those, a lot of those you have to go through at least a lot of the data foundational steps in order to go ahead and be successful. I typically see those in very kind of small, narrow projects and portions of an organization as opposed to rolled out across the organization. The longer you try to go, or the larger AI style solutions you try to go roll out, the more difficult it becomes.
Yeah, and look, let me maybe take a quick step back, Dave, based on your comment,
Mhm.
right? I don't think that the conversations with the end customers are necessarily of a new format, right? So over the
Mhm.
last couple of decades, everyone has been wanting to do lights out manufacturing, right? But once you start investigating what that actually takes, you realize how, well, number one, cost prohibitive it is, but also how diminishing the returns are the closer you get to the highest level of OE.
Mhm.
And it's no different for AI, right? To your point, you need to have a foundational data layer before you can actually send it to any LLM to get any output that is reasonable and can solve a problem, right? And this is where I think so Konstantin asked another good question, right? But the point of data is extremely, in my opinion, misunderstood. So there's still a lot of debates in different circles and different groups as to how data needs to be extracted, how data needs to be stored, how data needs to be synthesized. And my general opinion is that it is a very, very complex subject, and it is not something that you can achieve in just a very field swoop, even with a running organization, right? So I've done
Mhm.
a lot of projects to modernize very old systems. I've had many conversations with different stakeholders that require vastly different information even before you implement AI on top of it, right? And I can give you a specific example. So, in my early days at P&G, I still remember being frustrated by the data aggregation system that was basically collecting information every 5 minutes, right? So every 5 minutes, it just logs all of the PLC tags on the plant floor. And you can, of course, access them and you can see some of that on the trends on your MES and your ERP system. Well, obviously, for higher level metrics, it was fairly easy to capture how many cases have been made, what kind of stops have we had, right? Because you could create a register that would basically save the stop, the duration, what have you, and then log that into the system. So you could argue that you could query that system even with AI and get a general baseline of how well or how poorly the line was running. But me being on the engineering side, I was usually the last line of defense against highly technical outages, right? So if the line was down for 4+ hours, which resulted in $300,000 plus lost, and it was due to, let's say, a servo motor throwing up a specific fault, then they would call on basically the engineering team, and we would have to go and understand what had happened on the OT side. And of course, the 5 minute logs were and even my bosses at the time understood completely useless because they hadn't captured the state of those tags at the time of the event. So
Mhm.
this is where the question becomes very difficult. As you show up to a different manufacturer, you need to explain to them what is possible in the current state and what do they need to do to achieve the desired state, right? And this is where, again, there's going to be conversations on data compression, how many data pipelines you want, what kind of
Mhm.
historian you want to use. Can you just use the out of the box historian that comes with the SCADA system? Do you need to store this in the cloud? Does it need to be more robust? Can you pull every 3 milliseconds, which is the scan time of some of the most performant PLCs? Should you store that in a UNS or in a data lake? The answer is no, but it depends on what the use case is. So the short answer is that it is a very complex science, and it seems to me that a lot of the groups don't have that understanding of actual data, plant floor or
Mhm.
otherwise, to complete some of these tasks, I would say, to the requirements. And that's a long-winded to say, I guess, to answer that. Dave, any thoughts before we move on?
I think it's a good question. Maybe to be a bit more specific to Constantine's follow up question as to the
Hmm.
value of OT people with AI experience versus a bunch of shops who are AI shops and don't have the OT experience. I guess in my mind, the people without the OT experience are going to be found out very quickly, and I don't think that that really changes. When we add in AI or when we don't add in AI. I've worked with a bunch of groups, especially like IT centric groups, who have tried to make the transition over into the OT side. and they're just kind of glaring lack in understanding of process and of knowledge was a limit factor for them every single time we went down this path. So I appreciate it, Constantine. We've got a question and comment. We've got a question and comment here from Zach, talking about how building is the single best path for learning. Anthropic users sometimes will post resources, and he posted the skill tree. The anthro
Hmm.
Wow, I cannot talk. He posted the Git for in the skill tree. I agree. That's 100% a great resource. On the skills themselves, anthropic.com, I think it's slash skills. There are a bunch of different courses that you can go ahead and take as part of that, which are all very interesting. One of the things that, as I said, that I like to do is I like to ask Claude how to go build. And so I will go ask, hey, can we go build a skill? How do I go build a skill? I'm looking to build this particular skill. How do we go down it? Or I'm looking to go build an ignition skill. Can I go send you all of the user docs and other things? And you can go kind of ingest that. And what I liked when we did it in preparation for this conversation, in fact, was it asked several specific prompts are, what are you looking, basically, what are you looking to do? What are the angles you'd like to come at these solutions? How can we go about providing the correct context and the correct answers? And I
Yeah.
honestly, I was very impressed, especially Vlad, when we were at Prove It, with all of the people who had built very specific skills. So Lenny on the flow side had built a skill for an executive report. And I think it was the first time that I saw someone who had built a skill and could go share how they built a skill and why they did it. And I'm like, wow, that makes a lot of sense. Instead of having to go build 1,000 of very similar reports, we can just go ahead and prompt our way into those specific answers within those reports.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a good, I guess, continuation of that question from Constantine, which I do want to bring up together with Jason's comment, right? And again, this is obviously we are sharing our views based on our experiences. I think that it's important to have that lens as well. But basically, Constantine is asking, can you comment on the value of experience and background of people that build solutions with AI? Anyone can build a generic AI agent, but would you hire a person with OT experience to deal with solving OT related problems? It seems obvious, but many generic shops are being thrown around in manufacturing without any expertise who have never walked the floor. How do you deal with that? And the other comment that I was going to bring up, Jason made this all the way at the end, which basically says keep IT out of OT. And so, look, my general opinion in the current state of AI, right, and we are in March 2026, it is impossible to just let it run on its own, barring a few exceptions, right? Like, let's say vision cameras or vision systems have been internally using AI, and you can train the model without having the knowledge of how it works and basically letting it run, right? But in the general sense of LLMs and AI, my current statement would be workforce enablement. You are basically giving the tools to people that understand the processes in the systems in extremely well that they can then leverage to run Kaizen projects, right? If you're familiar maybe with the Lean Six Sigma terminology, but basically remediating some of the problems they have had and they could not have solved without the data and the tools that have been built on top of AI. So my, again, like general stance, especially in our industry, because the challenges are so multifaceted, meaning that it's usually electrical, mechanical, chemical, right? It involves different parties, safety, that it is very difficult to solve some of those problems without having deep expertise. That being said, I know personally, I know groups at the and I can't mention their names, but basically at the director or VP level, they made the decision simply because they cannot find enough people on the OT side to manage some of these projects. They have basically hired software engineers into, it's senior software slash manager positions that manage OT related projects. And so their vision is that they will empower them enough to understand the plant floor, but without any prior experience, they should have enough to solve and help the people solve some of those challenges. Personally, again, if I look at a startup or a small company that is building in our space a tool that leverages AI for, for an application that requires expertise, right? Again, I've mentioned vision, but it could be, let's say, dashboards, right? So anyone should understand what a good dashboard should look like. But to solve a cavitation problem with a pump, to solve a production like bottleneck issue, and they have nobody that has OT experience, to me that's a big red flag, right? So I don't believe that they will be successful once they start working with those customers in solving their actual problems on the plant floor. So that's my general opinion today. Maybe it will change in the future, but I don't think it is about AI just solving these problems on its own. It is really about workforce enablement.
I I would agree with that. And Vlad, I want to go bring up another topic that you and I have
Mhm.
discussed earlier in the week, talking about adoption or like the fear of being left behind when it comes to AI. And I had sent you a post of what I imagine was a generally well translated Mandarin into English post of basically a lot of management and a lot of white collar workers over in China are paying third parties, sometimes relatively little amounts of dollars, sometimes hundreds of dollars, to go and install Clawbot or now OpenClaw onto their personal devices, or maybe onto secondary, hopefully onto not personal devices, because man, well, we won't go into how I feel about that. But no, so going and installing this, not because they were exceptionally skilled and going down to go ahead and use that, but more so because management and all of the executives continue to go talk about AI and the need for AI tools, and there is a significant fear of being left behind. I've got some more thoughts on that,
Right.
but I guess for you, Vlad, kind of what are your early thoughts? Are you seeing a lot of adoption? Are you seeing or thinking that there are some people trying to stay up on the trends because they're afraid of being left behind? What is your views?
I would say that there's definitely a lot more fear of missing out today than before. But that's not to say that there's always been this set of bleeding edge companies that will always R&D projects no matter what. And again, referencing maybe my experience a little bit back to P&G, and this is openly known information, they have an R&D center in Cincinnati in which they will test out almost everything, right? Obviously, that has to do with manufacturing, but
Mhm.
very few of those solutions make it to the plant floor. And so I think, again, there's been multiple white papers released on the fact that a lot of these solutions don't necessarily end up in production environment, but everyone is trying to figure out what is possible, where does it affect our development, is this pre-engineering, is this maintenance, is this a quality opportunity? So I think everyone is trying to experiment. To what level of success, again, it's a very difficult question to answer, but I know that every single group that I talk to is trying to figure out what can we do and what
Mhm.
does AI mean, what's the next step, and of course nobody has that crystal ball. So very difficult question to answer.
Absolutely. I think that we will certainly see a reduction in the level of management at a lot of the organizations, and I think to a large extent we have started seeing some of that with entire groups, with the mass layoffs and rifts that we've seen at some of the larger Fortune 50 companies, FANG companies, etc. I think Oracle just announced a significant layoff of a significant percentage of their workforce, and so I guess as I look at it, I think especially in the industrial space, if you're one of the people physically doing something or interfacing with machines and doing that work, and your personal knowledge based upon years and years of experience is important, I feel like those people are generally going to be safe. I feel like the people who are managing that first level of a lot of individual contributors, and many times are individual contributors themselves, are going to be very safe. I feel like all of the additional layers above that, it will be very particularly interesting to see how much of that we're able to go leverage some of these AI tools and reduce the need to have those levels of people within especially larger organizations.
Yeah, and look, at the end of the day, again, it's a very complex problem, and there's been some comments in the chat made about companies pedaling back some of the investments or initiatives,
Mhm.
and that's just, I think it's the nature of business, right? I think that everyone sees the opportunity or the possibility of AI doing something highly beneficial for them. Then they bring in groups that will assess the current state, and depending on that assessment, at least again in my experience, they very quickly realize that it's a lot more expensive than they originally thought,
Mhm.
right? So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, many of the many people of the general public would have experimented with ChatGPT,
Mhm.
Gemini, in certain instances Claude, but they don't necessarily realize what does it take to get their facility or their business to a state where we can start seeing results. And again, you can make the argument maybe we can create a smaller pocket here where there is some ROI.
Mhm.
But again, in the facilities that I visit, there's still a lot of obsolete equipment. There's still a lot of work to be done on the OT network side, on the data side, like we've discussed a little bit earlier. And so to bring this into the financial side, at least in companies that are publicly traded, right, the largest companies, you need to have an ROI for your investors, and you immediately see this timeline of 3 to 5 years that is prohibitively expensive and thus difficult to justify for some of these pilot projects once you do see what the complexity and the costs are. I do want to progress us a little bit, Dave, if you don't mind, but I do want to, I guess, the retouch on the data side, right? So I
Mhm.
think that we've talked a little bit about that earlier, but you and I have had a architecture design episode as well, where we outlined the different layers of automation, different areas it can impact. I think that again, the efforts, and this is maybe some of my advice to customers that may be watching this video, is number one, understand where you currently stand from a business standpoint, but understand also what systems do you currently have capturing or not capturing any of the data that can be leveraged. I cannot stress this enough because, again, different parties require substantially different information, and different facilities will record different types of information depending on the industry, depending on their maturity, so on and so forth. And so, for me, the opportunity before we talk about AI is again in structuring the data properly, extracting the data properly, and
Mhm.
again, having the conversation of what does the quality department need? What does the maintenance department need? What does the engineering department need? Right. And so, maybe to bring up the theme you and I, Dave, will have in the month to come, is the goal of talking about industrial AI, but in different aspects, right? So the maintenance department that's going to use CMMS or computerized maintenance management system is going to need data about downtime, about breakdowns, but also data that doesn't only come from machines. It could be manuals on how some of the machines have been designed. It could be manuals on or docs on how issues have been resolved by previous maintenance teams. Versus engineering, you have a completely different view because you're looking at project development into 6 to 12 months periods at a time. So it's pre-engineering development. How have we built PLC code, right? And this could be a side note because there's a lot of companies trying to disrupt that space as well. Where do you feed the information on what good code actually looks like, and not the very little information that you can find in open source or I guess commercially available LLMs. So I think understanding how that entire web of data is structured for a specific organization and is one of the most critical steps, I would say, in a lot of my conversations and a lot of what I'm trying to evangelize with customers and anyone that I come in contact with in a general broader sense.
Absolutely. I think you bring up a good point, Vlad. We on our side internally have been having a number of conversations as to basically what does the future of AI data look like. I feel like in many of the conversations that we're having, we're not saying, but we're like kind of implying, hey, we're just going to take the same data from the same database and we're just gonna hit an MCP server and maybe we're gonna go build a couple of flows in N8N, and then we're just gonna go prompt away. Um,
Yes.
then we are just going to go prompt away. I I certainly don't see that realistically. And I will bring up Constantine's point. Most U.S. manufacturers run on Excel. Um, they wonder how they can leap into AI and skip all the prep work. I Man, I can't tell you how many times that the selling point of a system is can they export the system to Excel, because that is their level of comfort. No, I completely agree, but no, Vlad, to your point, I truly believe that we will have a maybe secondary set of systems that are intermediary and paralleled with MCP servers and not touching the initial set of data. I don't know if it'll be like we see in pharma and other groups where we go mirror databases and we're allowed to mirror databases. And then we take the mirrored database and we do our investigation and transposition into where we need to go. I I think we are too early to tell. Again, I feel like we are absolutely implying there will be no additional work or infrastructure, or at least many groups are implying that there'll be no additional work or infrastructure. Take your data, throw it into an MCP server with Claude, and go prompt away. That is certainly not where I see us moving
Yeah,
safely.
and I guess like look, as we wrap up the conversation, maybe we can bring up some of the challenges in a structured fashion, right? Because again, a lot of us have been having conversations with different manufacturers. I think it's important to figure out what is the path forward for some of these
Mhm.
items, because right now there are no, at least to my knowledge, standards when it comes to AI for some of these topics, right? And we talked about data availability and context. I think that is generally or broadly understood. Infrastructure, we talked about that as well, right? So as you're starting to collect data, it becomes a question, but a more important, I would say, infrastructure question that some of the manufacturers are asking: are we deploying on prem? Are we using
Mhm.
something in the cloud? If it's a regulated industry, it becomes a very, very difficult question to answer, because that's where you're starting to bridge IT and OT. That's where you
Mhm.
need to get involved in conversations as to who actually owns the data, who is
Mhm.
exposing that data to whichever party can also have access to it. And I actually had a conversation with someone from this chat on this exact topic, because again, manufacturers are very excited about the general premise of AI, but then you need to figure out, where do we actually run the models, where do we, or how do we train the models, who's going to provide the data to train the models. So data governance, you have mentioned this earlier as well, Dave, is
Yep.
extremely, extremely important. And I've not seen, like I said, a standard yet that has been built out specifically for this. I think there's a few companies that play in that space and try to have conversations or frameworks to help manufacturers. The next one, of course, is hallucinations. This was also mentioned
Yeah.
here in the chat. I think we all generally agree that there are going to be times where you prompt AI for something that's relatively basic, right? You can tell it, give me, for example, the 10 bullet points for this specific topic, and it will give you 14 for whatever reason. And so it is simply not. It is obviously acceptable in maybe certain circumstances in manufacturing, but when it involves machinery, when it involves safety, it becomes very difficult to to obviously implement something that will give you false positives a certain percentage of the time. So now you're starting to talk about tolerances and how much should
Mhm.
you accept those failure rates. And going back to my example with vision systems, there is no perfect system. So every machine is going to have a certain amount of downtime, similar to a vision system. If it's able to detect good versus bad, there will be a certain amount of bad product that goes through, or conversely, if it is very defensive, there will be some good product that gets rejected, right? So this is simply unavoidable, but we need to
Mhm.
figure out where does this actually fit into the general industrial landscape. Lack of documentation in our space, right? So this is a comment, and I've had many conversations around this topic with with a few different individuals, but the software industry, right? So if you go to Stack Overflow, is just filled with really good examples on how code should be produced. There's white papers written by top engineers at, and again, I say top based on their own internal designations, by Google, by Meta,
Mhm.
by Twitter, and many other companies. The space is just very mature. However, on the industrial automation side, I would I would dare anyone to go and find good documented PLC code written by, again, highly advanced engineers at some of the largest or maybe bleeding edge companies, and chances are it is not available. So it is very difficult to train the models based on what we currently have. Obviously, it will improve, but again, there need to be strategies as a result of this. And the same can be said about documentation of, software industries versus a lot of our equipment. It is very different. Last point, and you've mentioned this a little bit, cybersecurity, right? So again, and this is maybe where we can bring up really briefly the outage that happened at Stryker, but as a result of advancements in I think we're going to see more and more what's called basically like human engineering, right? And people accessing information that they shouldn't have, installing ransomware, malware. And so cybersecurity, I think, is going to be a very important topic when it comes to enabling some of these systems in the general industrial landscape. Dave, what are your thoughts?
There's a lot of things.
Yeah?
Is a
Yeah.
lot of things you said, Vlad. The
Yes.
chat is absolutely crushing it. One of the top chats in a while. Zach has a good comment that I wanted to go ahead and bring up. So 100% cherry picking this. But Zach saying agents aren't enough. You must mix the deterministic code with agents. In that example that I mentioned about Lenny and Prove It, the skill actually ran deterministic code to validate the report the agent produced met reporting requirements.
Mm, mhm.
I must have missed that part, Zach, but I 100% agree. We had an entire section here of LLM versus deterministic, but did not have a chance to get into that. I personally believe that the groups making the biggest advances on the AI side within manufacturing, industrial, and in fact, lots of spaces will be moving towards more of that deterministic code and moving away from a lot of these LLM models to get rid of the hallucinations and other things because it has to be believable. If the things that we're seeing are not believable, then they're not really worth the time or money or effort or tokens or any of those things that you are focusing on. Vlad, this has been fantastic. Do you want to share? Have there been any things that you have seen or worked on personally that you really like? Anything that Claude or some of these other agents are particularly good at that you'd like to go share?
Well, I guess I'll share based on the Prove It presentations experience, right? So for
Hmm.
me, I guess building with Claude has always been within its own, I would say, containerized application. And I know that our industry, when I say our industry, it's industrial automation,
Hmm.
is very closed off, meaning that you can, of course, if you take a Rockwell PLC, right, you can extract the L5K or L5X file and you can modify it enough to write even ladder logic or structured text, but it is fairly difficult to access them directly. And so for me, the interesting advancements have been obviously the unlock of MCPs by both inductive automation as well as TATSoft.
Mhm.
So having done a lot of work in the industrial space, which revolves around HMIs and SCADA and MES applications, I think that AI is really good at designing the basically the screens on the dashboards based on prompts. But
Mhm.
again, before these MCPs were made available, it was impossible to directly go into the code. And obviously, you can go into the 8.3 or Ignition 8.3 structure and do it just directly. But with
Mhm.
MCPs, I think it unlocks an entire new range of possibilities. So that's at least like where I see a whole lot of improvements and opportunities for the manufacturing sector. I've been looking at a few companies that are trying to change the way PLC code is created. I'm still not sold on that front, right?
Okay.
I'm still positively skeptical. I think that it might become better, and maybe there's going to be ways, like Zach has mentioned, to protect from what's being written via a human. But I know very well that even in a lot of these AI agents, most of us just click accept, 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 and allow the agent to make all the changes. So I think there's going to be some failures that we will see as a result of just letting AI based code into your control systems that has not been properly validated. But we will see. We will see.
I I agree. It's interesting to go see the direction. And I think that there it will be interesting to see if the direction is MCP or if the direction isn't MCP. MCP moves us in a path that I think we are all generally happy to go down. I mean, it scares the crap out of me with what people can do. Having said that, uh, having said that, I am worried. It's like giving access to a junior dev who has never been in SQL and saying, go ahead and figure out these things and go ahead and hopefully don't nuke the entire SQL database. And then you have to go ahead and rebuild it. I feel like we've all been there several times too many. So I think it'll be interesting to see the direction we go with MCP. I think when it comes to your examples, Vlad, I am particularly interested as to the fragility of delivering these solutions that are all prompted to go run on industrial solutions. I am unsure. I am unsure as to the longevity, be it 5 minutes or 50 years, as to what those will look like. I will say from my side, I've been particularly impressed on some of the reporting tools, as I think I mentioned earlier, looking at removing or reducing a lot of that manual reporting, potentially being able to go ahead and prompt that reporting, or be able to go ahead and prompt that easier than going and building manual reports in any of your report codecs, which are not fun, which are absolutely not fun. So I've been particularly impressed with what those look like and leverage those with a couple of skills, and you can have some pretty good looking outputs. I do personally enjoy telling code that there are problems and to please fix it, and then it will go slide by slide and generally fix about 80% of the problems that it has. But at least on first pass solutions, I feel like it does a fantastic job. Vlad, are we ready to call it?
Let me, I guess, make a final comment, right? And so Devi brought an interesting point, which is, the general ecosystem is moving away from MCPs. And this is what I find particularly interesting in the landscape of AI. I think that there's different communities building in different ways. And information is shared so asynchronously that it is difficult to keep up with what's going on and ultimately what is the cutting or the bleeding edge. So I will obviously take a look at the post that he referenced from Mitko Vasiliev, and he's basically saying that he deleted all MCPs and he's using skills plus CLI. So I have built, so skills have only been released a couple of days. I don't believe it's been a week yet. on the Claude Code side, but I have built a couple of skills. I certainly do not have
Mhm.
enough conviction to start deleting the MCPs. I know it is fairly prohibitive in terms of token costs, as
Yeah,
he's outlining in his post. Again, I think that it will take some more time and experimentation before I would put a definitive answer as to what it's going to look like. I think that the companies that are releasing MCPs, and I mentioned a few earlier, are obviously paying, or hopefully are paying attention to this. I don't want to say obviously because maybe they are not, and are going to create their own skills and make the tools more available and easier or less costly to use in this instance. So I'm going to continue to experiment. I would encourage everyone to keep sharing what they're doing. And I'm also trying to find, again, different ways and different workflows that make sense for me. And the problems and the challenges are going to be different, right? So if you're using something that already works to develop SCADA screens and maybe some PLC code, I think it's going to be vastly different for someone who's trying to develop, an application or maybe software at the IT layer in manufacturing. So I think for me, context also is extremely important, and context not only in the sense of for the AI, but context in terms of what the person is trying to solve. So it is important to understand that as well.
absolutely. Um, I think
Uh,
all very good points. I suppose no sooner do we launch the podcast and Vlad starts updating about the revolutionary MCP servers. Do MCP servers become extinct? Which is just how it goes sometimes. Which is
Yep.
just how it goes sometimes. But no, I think that to your point, Vlad, it goes back to the costs, right? The costs in the context window and the tokens. And while tokens are in theory fairly inexpensive, single dollars per millions, um, it really starts to add up. And then it starts to add up as you do it enterprise wide, and it just continues to expand from there. Having said that, everyone, thank you so much for hanging out with us this Wednesday afternoon if you're watching us live, this other time if you are not watching us live. If you already haven't, please make sure you follow along Manufacturing Hub for all of our latest news and updates, as well as Vlad and myself. Next month or next week, I suppose, we're diving all into what I hope are 4 or 5 really awesome industrial AI applications, stories, and solutions, and going and talking about a bunch of particulars. So please make sure to follow along for that. If you are watching on YouTube or in podcast form, you guys are amazing. Please do the like, subscribe, share, follow along. Rate us 5 stars, all of those super fun things. I remember to ask, and you guys do it. And then we've got more than 1,000 YouTube subscribers, and we've got thousands of active listeners every month, which is pretty cool. Until next week.